The thundering hooves struck the mountain trail like war drums, a pounding rhythm that echoed against the sheer stone walls of Montana's Bitterroot Range. Dust billowed upward, stinging Felicity Hawthorne's eyes as she clung to the side of the careening wagon, her gloved fingers gripping the splintering wood with all the strength left in her arms. Her knuckles had gone white, her shoulders burned, and her chest ached with the frantic pace of her heart. Every jolt of the wheels over rocks threatened to fling her into the open air. She had never known fear like this. Not in her ordered Boston lecture halls, not in the quiet parlor rooms where she taught poetry and prose to eager young women. This was raw, primal terror. The wagon was no longer under human control. Two draft horses, wide-eyed and frothing, bolted in a desperate flight down the winding pass, spurred not by whip or command, but by sheer panic. Somewhere back along the trail, a rattlesnake had coiled too close, spooking the team into chaos. The elderly driver, Mr. Guthrie, had been hurled from his seat almost at once. That left Felicity alone, tossed about like a rag doll on the bouncing, doomed vehicle. "Help!" she screamed, though her voice was nothing against the roar of the wheels and the wild thunder of hooves. The trail bent sharply, and she knew in her bones, that she could not hold on much longer. Her grip slipped. For a breathless instant, she was airborne. Blue sky wheeled overhead, pine trees blurred into a whirl of green and gold, and the ground rushed up to claim her. She closed her eyes, bracing for shattering impact, but instead of rocks and hard-packed earth, she slammed into something solid yet mercifully alive. Strong arms caught her mid-fall, wrapping around her with a force that stole her breath. The two of them tumbled together down a slope of dry grass, rolling until momentum spent itself. At last they came to rest, his body curled protectively around hers, his breath warm against her temple. "I've got you, ma'am," came a deep, steady voice. Felicity blinked her eyes open. Dust swirled around them, glowing in the harsh sun. Above her hovered a face she might have sworn belonged in a dime novel. Sun-bronzed skin, a square jaw shadowed by stubble, and eyes the startling color of Montana's high mountain lakes, clear, piercing blue. A battered leather hat shaded his brow, and a bandana hung loose around his neck. "The wagon!" she gasped, twisting instinctively to look back up the trail. "Let it go," he said firmly, his arms still securing her. "Nothing in there worth your life." Even as he spoke, a distant crash echoed from the valley below. The runaway wagon had met its inevitable end. Only then did he release her. "Orich." Helping her to sit upright. "Are you hurt?" Felicity's breath came shallow. She brushed at her dirt-smeared traveling gown, flexing her legs and arms in a quick check. I don't think so," she said, though her voice shook. "Thanks to you, Mr. Tucker," he replied, lifting his hat briefly in rough courtesy. "Tucker Reed." "Felicity Hawthorne," she managed, extending a trembling hand. He took it gently, his grip firm but careful. "I believe you just saved my life, Mr. Reed." A dimple appeared in his cheek as he smiled. "Just doing what any man would do, Miss Hawthorne." But Felicity knew that wasn't true. It had taken not just courage, but near impossible swiftness to intercept her fall. Few men could have done it, and fewer still would have tried. She found herself staring a beat too long into those lake blue eyes before she caught herself and looked away, cheeks burning. "We should check on your driver," Tucker said, scanning the trail uphill. "Yes, Mr. Guthrie." Felicity scrambled to her feet, favoring her left ankle with a wince. The tender joint throbbed but held her weight. She pressed forward with Tucker at her side. They found the elderly driver sitting on the roadside 100 yards back, pale and shaken but conscious. His legs stuck out at an unnatural angle. "Miss Hawthorne!" he croaked with relief when he saw her. "Thank the Lord you're safe. I couldn't hold them horses. Snake spooked 'em good." "It's not your fault," Felicity said quickly, kneeling despite the ache in her ankle. "Are you badly hurt?" Mr. Guthrie grimaced. "Reckon this leg's done for a while." Tucker crouched, his large hands carefully feeling along the shin. "Clean break," he said after a moment. "Painful, but he'll heal. We need to get you to a doctor." Rising, he added, "My ranch is about 3 miles west. I've a wagon there. We'll bring you both back. Then I'll ride for the doctor in Willow Creek." "That's kind of you," Felicity began, though she hated the thought of imposing. "Miss Hawthorne," Tucker said gently but firmly. "You're 20 miles from Helena, no transport, a busted driver, and a sprained ankle. This isn't an imposition. It's necessity." She pressed her lips together, conceding. Thank you, Mr. Reed. Tucker, he corrected with a quick smile. Anyone I've pulled from certain death gets to call me Tucker. Despite herself, Felicity returned the smile. Then you must call me Felicity. Tucker moved with calm efficiency. He tore strips from his own bandana to fashion a splint, then helped Guthrie lean against a pine trunk. I'll fetch my wagon. Hour, maybe less. He pressed a canteen into Felicity's hands. Plenty of water. Rest that ankle. Before she could reply, he mounted a chestnut gelding tethered nearby. With a light touch of the reins, horse and rider bounded down the trail, disappearing in a swirl of dust. Felicity exhaled slowly, her chest still tight with adrenaline. She poured water into the cap and offered it to Guthrie, who sipped gratefully. That's a good man there, he muttered, nodding toward where Tucker had vanished. Saw him catch you. Never seen anyone move like that. Yes, Felicity murmured, still staring down the empty trail. He certainly appeared at the right moment. Providence, if you ask me. She smiled faintly but said nothing. Her gaze drifted to the rugged horizon, where jagged peaks cut sharp against the sky. Somewhere beyond lay Helena, and the business that had brought her to Montana. But all thoughts of settling her late father's estate seemed distant now, as if her life had shifted course. The moment strong arms had caught her in freefall. True to his word, Tucker returned before the hour was out, driving a sturdy wagon with 2 solid draft horses. He'd brought blankets and pillows, which he arranged to make Guthrie as comfortable as possible in the wagon bed. Then he turned to Felicity. She tried climbing aboard herself, but her ankle gave way with a flash of pain. Before she could protest, Tucker swept her up in his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing. She gasped, arms instinctively circling his neck. For the second time that day, she found herself pressed to his broad chest, inhaling the mingled scents of leather, pine, and clean sweat. Her heartbeat betrayed her with its sudden quickening. I can manage, she murmured, though weakly. No sense worsening that ankle, Tucker replied in a voice that rumbled through his chest against her cheek. He set her gently on the bench seat, then climbed up beside her. With a snap of the reins, the wagon lurched forward, carrying them away from the wreckage and toward whatever came next. The Bitterroot Valley spread wide before them, a rolling expanse of grassland framed by snow-tipped peaks. The air carried scents of sage and wood smoke, sharp and clean. For a long while, neither spoke, each lost in thought. At last, Tucker broke the silence. So what brings you to Helena, Miss Hawthorne? Felicity clasped her hands in her lap. My father passed away 3 months ago. I've come to settle his affairs and decide what to do with his property. Judge Hawthorne, Tucker asked, glancing at her with surprise. Her eyes widened. You knew him? Not personally, but everyone in these parts knew of him. Fair man, territory's poor without him. Felicity's throat tightened. Thank you, she said softly. Silence stretched again. Felicity studied the line of Tucker's jaw, the steadiness of his hands on the reins, and wondered at the strange twist of fate that had set her path across his. She had boarded the wagon that morning, expecting only dust and business. Instead, she had found terror, rescue, and a man whose presence unsettled her in ways she did not yet understand. As the wagon rattled onward, the sinking sun bathed the valley in gold, and Felicity had the curious sense that her life had shifted direction, not with careful planning or choice, but with the sudden, breathtaking force of falling into someone's arms. And somewhere deep inside, she knew that this wild country had not finished with her yet. The wagon crested a low rise, and the valley opened like a book, all clean lines and lived-in margins. A plank archway spanned the lane ahead. The brand burned dark across the beam, Circle B. Beyond it, fences ran straight to a spread of corrals, a long barn with fresh paint, a workshop with its doors thrown wide, and a whitewashed house set square to the mountains as if it had been planted there on purpose. A windmill turned slow over the well, creaking in the good way that means it's doing work. Home, Tucker said, not with pride so much as belonging. His hands lightened on the reins, and the team eased from a trot to a purposeful walk. Felicity felt the change in him through those hands, how the line of his shoulders softened, how his breath came easier as the ranch's familiar shape wrapped around him. A woman stepped out onto the porch before the wagon rolled to a stop. She was trim and straight-backed, gray hair braided and pinned neatly under a kerchief, an apron tied over a dark dress. A dish towel hung in her hands like a flag of truce. Mercy, she said, scanning the wagon's cargo with an appraiser's cool eye. You brought half the mountains in with you. Mrs. Fitzgerald, Tucker called, already climbing down to steady the team. We've got a broken leg and a turned ankle." "Then don't stand there narrating it," she replied briskly. "Bring them in." Her gaze landed on Felicity. The briskness eased. "We'll get you right, dear." Between them, they made quick work of it. Tucker lifted Mr. Guthrie as carefully as if he were made of glass, and in that one motion, Felicity understood the man's strength wasn't only in his arms. He knew how to carry another's weight without making a show of it. Guthrie's grimace threaded into a rueful smile. "I'm lighter than a sack of oats, son. No need for ceremony." "Ceremonies for Sunday," Tucker said. "This here's Tuesday work." In a downstairs room with lace curtains and a patchwork quilt, Mrs. Fitzgerald settled the driver with pillows and cool water and a promise of broth. Then she turned to Felicity with the same efficient compassion. "Upstairs with you. Mind that ankle now." The staircase was shallow and wide enough to favor her sore foot. At the landing, sunlight slanted through a window and pooled like a warm hand on Felicity's shoulder. The guest room smelled faintly of lavender and wood polish. On the bed waited a neatly stacked set of clothing, simple calico, a shawl, soft stockings. "These belong to Mr. Reed's sister," Mrs. Fitzgerald said, reading the question on Felicity's face. "Moved to California after she married, left a few things behind for when we had company. And here you are, company." Felicity's throat tightened. "You're very kind." "Not at all, dear. Kindness is cheaper than pride and warms better in winter." Mrs. Fitzgerald tipped her chin toward a washstand where steam rose from a blue and white basin. "Fresh water. Take your time. I've sent for the doctor." When Felicity closed the door, she sagged against it for a moment, all the hours of fear and grit again catching up to her at once. She removed her dusty dress, winced as she freed the swollen ankle from her boot, and washed until the trail rinsed away and her skin remembered what it felt like to be tended. The borrowed dress fit well enough. The shawl smelled faintly of cedar. In the cracked mirror, she gathered her hair into something like order, then sat a minute longer with her father's name in her mouth like a prayer she didn't know how to say. By the time she hobbled back downstairs, a stocky man with wire spectacles and a leather bag had taken Mr. Guthrie's measure. "Dr. Martin," he said by way of greeting, wiping his hands. "We've splinted the leg proper. He'll mend so long as he doesn't get clever about it." "Can't get clever if I never was," Guthrie muttered, already drifting into a heavy sleep. "And you," the doctor said, turning to Felicity with a gentler voice. "Let's see that ankle." He prodded, hummed, wrapped it snug in clean linen. "Sprain. Not bad as it could be. I'll leave extra bandage. Stay off it for 2 days." "I mean it." She nodded, grateful for the certainty of a man who knew what to do with pain. They ate early, around a scrubbed pine table near the kitchen, where a window framed the last of the light, like a painting. Mrs. Fitzgerald set down roast beef with pan gravy, potatoes smashed with butter, greens bright with vinegar. Felicity's stomach surprised her by remembering hunger. Partway through the meal, a chair scraped softly and an older man entered, tall despite the stoop of age, hair white as cottonseed, eyes the same improbable blue as his son's. He wore a vest that had seen years of work and a watch chain that glinted when he moved. "Evenin'," he said, easing into the seat Tucker pulled out for him. He nodded toward Felicity. "And who might we be saving from calamity today?" "Oliver Reed," Tucker said to Felicity. "My father." The elder Reed extended a hand across the table, his grip warm and dry. "If my boy rescued you from anything, your family till further notice." "Felicity Hawthorne," she said, and watched recognition pass over his face like a cloud that brings rain. "Hawthorne," he repeated, leaning back. "Judge Hawthorne, may God rest him. Settled a water rights mess for me a decade back. Didn't let me win, mind you, just made me see why I shouldn't. A fair man, we could use more." Felicity's fork paused halfway to her mouth. The ache she carried for her father lightened at the corners. "Thank you," she said. "It means more than you know." "Eat," Mrs. Fitzgerald instructed from the stove, not unkindly. "Praise won't keep your strength up." They obeyed. Conversation found the easy channel it takes when people are tired and grateful. This year's hay, a mare due to foal, a hireling with a gift for fence mending and a weakness for tall tales. Felicity listened more than she spoke, catching the rhythm of a house where work and humor braided together. After supper, Tucker offered the porch. "Best medicine I know for a long day." he said, setting a chair for her and propping her ankle on a footstool. He lit a lantern, turned the wick low, and the world rearranged itself around a pocket of golden light. Beyond the railing, a chorus of crickets began their stitchwork, night sewing itself tight. Montana twilight had its own rules. The sky didn't darken so much as deepen, color soaking inward until the first stars pricked through. The mountains wore the last blue of the day across their shoulders like shawls. Felicity sipped coffee she didn't strictly need and let herself be quiet in a way Boston rarely permitted. "You from the city," Tucker said after a while. Not a question, just a statement of scale. "Boston," she answered. "I teach literature, or did." She turned the cup in her hands. "I haven't decided yet what I am now." "Things have a way of deciding themselves out here," he said. "Sometimes all you do is say yes." She thought about how he'd said home when they passed under the arch, how he'd said Tuesday work and made it sound like a promise. "Your mother must have loved books," she said, nodding toward the glow through the parlor windows. In that soft light, she'd glimpsed shelves and shelves. "She did," he said, and there was a kind of reverence in it. "Had a crate sent from back east every spring. Said a ranch house ought to have a library same as any judge's parlor, else the children would grow up strong in the back and thin in the head." He smiled. "I could show you tomorrow, if you're up to hobbling that far." "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. They sat without hurry. Somewhere in the dark a nightbird trilled once and fell silent. Felicity felt the wagon's terror unspool at last, replaced by a tiredness that didn't scare her. She had a place to set it down. When she rose to go inside, Tucker offered his arm. He matched his steps to her uneven ones like a dance learned on the fly. At her door, he touched the brim of his hat. "I'm sorry for what brought you to Montana," he said, eyes steady on hers. "But I'm not sorry you're here." She swallowed. "Neither am I." Sleep took her fast and clean. Morning arrived in the high country way, bright, unapologetic. The ranch came up like a body stretching, doors thrown wide, smoke ribboning from the chimney, men's voices greeting the day with the shorthand of people who know what needs doing. From her window, Felicity watched the corrals come alive, horses shouldering one another like schoolboys, a red calf bawling until its mother answered from the next pen. The windmill creaked again. A hawk cut a straight line over the pasture. Mrs. Fitzgerald delivered a breakfast tray like an edict. Scrambled eggs, a heel of bread, a jar of strawberry preserves. "You eat," she said, setting it across Felicity's lap. "Doctor said no heroics." "I'll try to be ordinary," Felicity promised, and earned the slightest upturn of the housekeeper's mouth. Later, Tucker tapped gently at the doorframe and leaned in with a question that wasn't quite a question. "Library?" She nodded and let him help her down the hall. The room had windows on two sides and floor-to-ceiling shelves knocked together by a patient hand with an eye for square corners. Titles in gilt and frayed cloth marched along the cases. Dickens beside Emerson, Shakespeare fraternizing with a well-thumbed veterinary manual. Felicity's fingers found familiar spines as if shaking hands with old friends. "Wordsworth," she breathed, lifting a leather volume where the gold had softened with use. Inside the front cover, a delicate script read, "To Ellen Reed, who finds wildness and beauty are not opposites. L.M., Boston, 1869. My mother's cousin," Tucker explained. "A schoolteacher back east. They wrote letters." She pictured a woman setting ink to paper in lamplight while snow shouldered Boston's windowsills. Another woman here in Montana reading those lines with sage on the air. It pleased her, that invisible thread tugging the two places together. "What did you study?" Tucker asked, leaning in the doorway as if nothing on earth could hurry them. "Literature," she said, returning the book to its shelf with a careful pat. "Poetry, the romantics especially." Then, because it felt fair to offer him a piece of the truth, "When I wrote to my father, I sometimes tucked in a poem. He teased me for it, said a courtroom liked logic better than lyric, but he kept them anyway." "He kept other things," Tucker said quietly. "Pa said the judge carried more regrets than he let on." The words settled between them like a blanket laid over a sleeping child. Felicity nodded, eyes stinging unexpectedly. "I think if I'd come sooner." "You came when you could," Tucker said. It wasn't forgiveness, just a simple statement that made forgiveness possible. By afternoon, her ankle consented to bear a bit of weight, if she coaxed it. Tucker appeared with a pair of walking sticks, dried aspen branches sanded smooth. "Don't ask me to carve anything fancy," he said, "but I can make a straight thing straight." "I'll take honesty over ornament," she replied, testing their balance. He grinned. "You'll do in Montana." They carried iced tea to the shade at the edge of the yard, where cottonwood leaves fanned a tinkling music. Oliver Reed sat on a bench, whittling a sliver of pine into what might become a horse or might become fire starting. He squinted at Felicity's approach. "You look less likely to fall over dead than yesterday," he declared. "I feel less likely," she said, taking the seat beside him. "You staying through supper?" "If Mrs. Fitzgerald allows it," Felicity answered, and the old man barked once in approval. Tucker spent the hour mending a gate latch while he and his father batted the ball of conversation back and forth with the skill of men who still liked each other after years of shared work. This pasture's grass going thin since the late frost, the price of oats 3 towns over, whether lightning was more likely to strike the windmill this summer or the barn roof, and what a sensible man might do about it. Felicity listened, and something loosened inside her that had been drawn tight too long, the string of always proving herself in rooms where books weighed more than hands. Toward evening, a rider trotted in from the West Trail, raising his hat at the porch. Tucker went to meet him and returned with a scrap of paper folded small. "Telegraph from Helena," he said. "Abernathy and Wells, your father's attorneys." Felicity's stomach fluttered. She unfolded the slip. "We are prepared to receive you any day this week. Estate documents in order. Please advise arrival. J. Abernathy. "I can take you day after tomorrow," Tucker said, reading her face rather than the paper. "Give that ankle one more day to behave. We'll get you a decent room and see you landed where you need to be." "You've done more than enough," she protested softly. His expression didn't change. "I'll worry less if I'm there," he said simply, as if it were the most practical thing in the world. "Then I'll be grateful for your company," she replied, and discovered she meant that more than she meant any notion of propriety she'd been taught in Boston parlors. They ate stew and biscuits and late peaches Mrs. Fitzgerald had put up when the world was hotter. After, Oliver told a story about a spring flood that carried a chicken coop a quarter-mile downstream with 2 outraged hens and a rooster standing on the roof like ship's captains. "Left them right where the water set them down," he finished, knife flashing as a tiny horse finally revealed itself from the scrap of pine. "Figured God relocated them fair and square." Felicity laughed with the others, then quietly tucked the little horse into her pocket when Oliver pretended not to notice he'd set it beside her. The night deepened. Tucker walked her to the foot of the stairs, removed his hat, and found words that held steady. "Town's full of strangers," he said, "but you won't be one there. Your father's name still means something. Mine, a little. Between them, I figure you'll have a fair start." She held his gaze, all the noise of the day falling away until only the thing that was their connection hummed in the space between them. "Thank you," she said, because thank you covered rescue and shelter and the loan of a future she hadn't known to imagine. He tipped his hat. "Rest up. Tomorrow we'll see to the team and your telegram." Felicity climbed the stairs slowly, not minding the ache. In her room, she loosened the borrowed shawl and stood by the window a while. The Circle B lay quiet beneath the stars, the barn a dark hulking kindness, the windmill a black scribble against the sky. Somewhere out there, a calf mewed and a mother answered, certain and immediate. She pressed her palm to the cool glass and felt with a certainty that startled her that she had not simply been spared disaster, she had been diverted, turned from one trail to another by the quick grip of strong arms and the open door of a place that felt, if not hers, then at least a place that would not spit her out. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the dark, to the mountains, to the name Hawthorne that still echoed in rooms where men remembered fairness. "Tomorrow, Helena. After that, we'll see." And when she lay down, the house settled around her the way a good book does when you're exactly the reader it was written for, its weight right, its pages whispering of what comes next. The morning sun broke across the Bitterroot Range in strokes of gold and lavender, pouring into Felicity Hawthorne's borrowed room at Circle B. She rose gingerly, testing her ankle against the floorboards. It still ached, but the swelling had eased beneath Dr. Martin's careful wrapping. She dressed in the calico gown Mrs. Fitzgerald had left, the simple fabric oddly comforting after the ruin of her own fine traveling dress. From the window, she watched the ranch stir awake. A pair of young ranch hands drove cattle toward fresh pasture, dust trailing behind them like banners. The sound of men's voices carried, punctuated by a dog's bark and the steady rhythm of hammer on wood where someone mended fencing. The sheer scale of it was different from anything she had known. Boston had its bustle, but it was a human-made tide. This was life that ran bigger than any clock. By the time she made her careful way downstairs, Mrs. Fitzgerald had set breakfast. Eggs fried crisp at the edges, sourdough bread, and black coffee that smelled like a promise. Tucker sat at the far end of the table, already halfway through his plate. He rose immediately when Felicity appeared, pulling out a chair as though she were some Boston lady visiting a drawing room rather than a woman hobbling on a sprained ankle in borrowed calico. "Morning, Miss Hawthorne," he said. "Good morning, Tucker," she replied, settling in. She sipped the coffee gratefully. Strong, bitter, honest. Oliver Reed appeared a few minutes later, lowering himself into a chair with a grunt but bright eyes. "Looks like you survived your first night under our roof," he said. "Quite comfortably, thank you." Felicity smiled. "Your home is very welcoming." Oliver tapped his spoon against the table. "That's Mrs. Fitzgerald's doing. Tucker and I would let the walls fall down around us, if not for her." The housekeeper snorted, but accepted the compliment in silence, bustling past with more bread. Later that morning, Tucker guided Felicity into the ranch's library. She paused in the doorway, caught by the sight. Shelves rising floor to ceiling, lined with volumes whose spines bore the weight of travel and years. Some leaned against each other companionably. Others stood stiff with dignity. The air smelled faintly of paper, leather, and pine resin. "My mother," Tucker explained quietly. "She believed a ranch without books was half a home." Felicity traced a finger along the shelf, pausing at Emerson, Dickens, Shakespeare. Her heart caught when she found a well-loved Wordsworth, the leather cover softened by handling. She lifted it reverently, as though the poet himself might still whisper from the pages. "She had excellent taste," Felicity murmured. Tucker leaned against the doorframe, watching her rather than the books. "She would have liked you." Felicity set the book down carefully, her throat tight with something she could not name. For years she had carried her love of poetry like a small, private lantern. To find it here in a ranch library at the edge of the wilderness felt like stumbling upon a kindred flame. They lingered there for some time, speaking of authors and ideas. Felicity was surprised by the quickness of Tucker's mind, the way he listened with genuine interest. He had not studied poetry in any formal sense, but he understood the rhythm of words as he understood the rhythm of horse hooves and rainstorms. "You think like a rancher," she teased at one point. "How's that?" "You see structure, you look for what holds together, and you notice when something's out of balance." He grinned. "That's ranching, all right. And maybe life, too." That afternoon, Felicity took her tea outside beneath the cottonwoods while Tucker repaired a fence nearby. Oliver settled on the bench beside her, whittling at a piece of pine. Shavings gathered at his boots like pale snow. "Your father," Oliver said after a long silence. "He carried himself with fairness. Didn't always get the thanks for it, but he didn't flinch. You favor him in the eyes." The words struck her deeply. She had not seen Judge Hawthorne in 5 years, not since her mother's remarriage, and the widening gulf that followed. Regret pricked her sharp as needles. "I wish I had come sooner," she admitted softly. Oliver's knife paused. Time has a way of closing doors, but sometimes it leaves windows. He handed her the small carving. "A horse, rough, but full of life. Take that. Remind yourself, not everything is gone just because it's changed." She accepted it with tears pressing at the corners of her eyes. Evening fell with long shadows stretching across the yard. At supper, Tucker unfolded a small telegram that had arrived from Helena. He passed it to Felicity. "Prepared to receive you any day this week. Estate documents in order. J. Abernathy, attorney at law." Her stomach fluttered as she read. Business. The reason she had come. The reason she had braved this land in the first place. "I'll take you the day after tomorrow," Tucker said. "Give your ankle one more day to mend. We'll see you settled proper." "You've already done more than enough," she protested softly. Tucker's eyes held hers steady as a river stone. "I'll worry less if I'm there. That's reason enough." And Felicity, surprising herself, realized she was glad of it. Later that night, she stood by the upstairs window with the wooden horse in her hand. The Circle B lay hushed beneath the stars, the barn dark and the fences drawn like careful lines across the pasture. Somewhere beyond, Helena waited with its papers and attorneys, and the ghost of her father's voice in every corner. But tonight she felt the warm pulse of the ranch beneath her, steady as a heartbeat. Strong arms had pulled her from disaster, yes, but perhaps also into something she had not known she was seeking. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow, Helena. After that, perhaps more. And for the first time in years, Felicity let herself wonder what it might mean to belong. The journey to Helena took the better part of a day. Tucker had readied the wagon before dawn, the team of draft horses well fed and eager to pull. Felicity, wrapped in a shawl and with her ankle carefully bound, climbed aboard with his steadying hand. The morning air held the crisp edge of late summer turning toward autumn, the kind of air that sharpened the sky into an impossible blue. As they rattled along the wide road into town, Felicity found herself watching the land more than the horizon. Stretches of golden prairie rolled away toward mountains that seemed always to be receding, inviting her deeper. Boston had its beauty, but it was framed by human hands. Parks trimmed, streets mapped, buildings designed. Here, beauty grew wild, unapologetic, and endless. "You're quiet," Tucker observed as he guided the reins with the ease of long practice. "I was just thinking," Felicity said. "My father saw this land before I did, and he chose to stay. I wonder what he saw in it that I've yet to understand." Tucker's mouth curved into a half-smile. "Maybe he saw the same thing you're seeing now. Wide open space that doesn't demand anything of you except honesty." She considered that. "And yet it does demand, doesn't it? Strength, endurance, courage." "That too," Tucker agreed, "but it gives back in equal measure. That's the bargain." Helena was already stirring when they arrived mid-morning. The town bustled with miners, ranchers, and merchants, a rough symphony of boots on boardwalks, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, and the chatter of women bartering at the market. Buildings rose sturdier than the frontier shacks Felicity had expected. Brick fronts, glass windows, signs painted in proud lettering. The territorial capital carried itself like a city intent on becoming permanent. Mr. Abernathy's law office was set above a mercantile store, with polished wood floors and a large desk stacked with papers in meticulous order. The man himself was tall and thin, his spectacles balanced precariously on a sharp nose. He greeted Felicity with formal courtesy, his voice clipped but respectful. "Miss Hawthorne, I trust your journey was eventful." His gaze flicked briefly to Tucker before returning to her. "You could say that," Felicity answered dryly. He gestured for them to sit. "Your father's affairs are mercifully straightforward. As his sole heir, you inherit his property, a ranch on the outskirts of Helena, along with a modest bank account and personal effects." He slid a folder of documents across the desk. "There have already been offers on the property. With your consent, we could arrange a sale within weeks." Felicity opened the folder, scanning the tidy descriptions. 160 acres, a modest house, a barn, a corral, creek access, no debts, no livestock listed. A caretaker named Peterson maintained the place. "What did my father use it for?" she asked quietly. "A retreat," Abernathy replied. "He was not a rancher, as you know, but he valued the solitude. He kept a few horses, but primarily it was a place of peace for him." Felicity's throat tightened. She had imagined her father as a stern figure in courtrooms, his life defined by rules and judgment. The thought of him keeping a quiet refuge in the Montana hills touched her unexpectedly. "I'd like to see it," she said firmly. "Of course. The caretaker visits every few days. I can provide the keys." Abernathy's eyes lingered on her, as though weighing whether she was the kind of woman to hold land or to sell it. Tucker shifted beside her, his presence steady, as if silently lending her weight. They left the office with the keys and a small box of her father's belongings. Back in her hotel room that evening, Felicity opened it with hands that trembled despite her efforts at composure. Inside were objects that pulled her heart in two directions at once. His pocket watch, its surface worn smooth by years of use. The fountain pen she had given him long ago. A daguerreotype of her as a child between her parents, both smiling in a way she barely remembered. At the bottom lay a leather-bound journal, its cover creased and soft. She opened it, and her father's familiar hand leapt from the page. "I rode out to the Aspens today. The leaves turned sooner here, catching fire before the rest of the land. There is peace in their trembling gold. I thought of Felicity, wondering if she will ever see this place. We are more alike than she knows, both stubborn, both seekers of beauty. If she comes here after I am gone, I hope she will understand why I could not leave. Tears blurred the ink until she closed the journal against her chest. She had expected legalities and transactions. Instead, she had found her father's voice reaching through time, calling her to a place he loved. The next morning, Tucker hitched the team once again, and they rode out to the small ranch that was now hers. The road wound through rolling hills, stands of aspen and pine, breaking the monotony of grass. As they crested a rise, Felicity caught her breath. The house stood simple but proud against the backdrop of mountains, its porch wide and welcoming. A meadow spread before it, dotted with late summer wildflowers, while a creek glinted like a silver ribbon nearby. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Tucker nodded. "Your father had an eye for land. Good water, strong soil, sheltered by the ridge. Whoever lives here could make a good life." But Felicity barely heard him. She stepped down from the wagon and approached the porch, her hand trembling as she fit the key into the lock. The door opened with a sigh, as if the house itself had been waiting. Inside, dust motes swirled in shafts of sunlight. The main room held a stone fireplace, shelves lined with familiar books, and a desk scattered with papers. Felicity touched each thing as though it were fragile. In the bedroom, she found framed photographs, her graduation, her parents' wedding, her as a baby in her father's arms. Her knees gave out, and she sat heavily on the bed. "He kept me close," she whispered, "even when I felt far away." Tucker stood in the doorway, hat in his hands. "He loved you," he said simply. They spent the afternoon exploring the property with Mr. Peterson, the caretaker, a weathered man with steady hands and quiet respect for the judge. He pointed out the corral, the barn roof in need of repair, the strength of the pasture. He wanted it kept in good order, Peterson said. Said it reminded him of something he couldn't explain, but wouldn't give up. By the time they returned to Helena, Felicity knew the truth that had been building in her since opening the journal. She could not sell this place. It was more than land. It was her father's voice, his solace, and now her inheritance not of property, but of belonging. That night, sitting across from Tucker at the hotel dining table, she spoke aloud what her heart had already decided. "I'm not going to sell the ranch," she said. Tucker's eyes met hers, blue and unwavering. "Then you're staying." "Not yet," she admitted. "I still have obligations in Boston, but when they're finished, yes, I think I'll return." A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that began in the eyes and traveled to the heart. "Then I'll be waiting." For the first time since her father's passing, Felicity felt the weight of grief lift just enough to let hope in. By mid-September, the sky over the Gallatin Valley had turned the pale, hard blue that meant change was coming. Mornings began with a skin of frost on the water trough, and evenings brought wind that combed the grass flat and set the aspen leaves to whispering. Felicity had returned to the Double R with Tucker after Helena, her father's journal tucked safely beneath her shawl, and found herself moving through the ranch like a person who'd been living in a house with the window shut and suddenly thrown them all open. On the third morning back, a storm rose out of the mountains, fast enough to catch everyone unprepared. It started with a gray rim at the horizon, then came the distant grumble, and then, as if the sky had simply decided, the rain came hard and cold. A straight fall of water that hammered the yard and turned the lane to mud in minutes. Tucker and the hands were already out along the lower pasture, pushing the cattle to higher ground. Oliver watched from the porch with a blanket thrown over his shoulders, the front of his white hair plastered flat, his old soldier's eyes scanning the fence line as if he could will it to hold. "River'll swell," he said simply, and Felicity heard in his voice a note that wasn't fear, but respect. Mrs. Fitzgerald had a kettle going and a fire built to a steady roar. "Storm like this in September," she clucked. "We'll be drying socks for a week." Felicity had just set the kettle's whistle back when the yard gate banged open and a boy hurled himself through it, hatless, hair plastered to his skull with rain. He couldn't have been more than 12. His chest heaved as he slid to a stop on the slick porch boards. "Mr. Reed!" he shouted, and then saw Oliver instead. "Mr. Reed, sir, the footbridge is gone. The creek took it. Molly, she's stuck on the gravel bar. Ma sent me. Pa's out at the pens." The words came in a tumble, but they were enough. Felicity was already grabbing for her shawl. "Where?" Oliver's voice was iron. "South Bend, where the creek forks by the old cottonwood. We was gathering deadfall and—" The boy's throat worked. "She stepped out and the water come up fast. I ran for help." "Fitz, fetch blankets and the big coil of rope," Oliver said, already stepping into his boots. He turned to the boy. "Sam Morse, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," the boy gulped. "Good lad to come quick." Oliver's eyes flicked to Felicity. "Cole's out with the herd." He caught himself, corrected with the name that had already settled into her bones. "Tucker's out. We can't wait for him." "I'll go with Sam," Felicity said before she had time to consider the way the rain hissed off the eaves or the fact that the creek at the South Bend ran quick, even in fair weather. Oliver hesitated only a heartbeat, the amount of time it takes a man to measure two risks and choose the one he can live with. "Daisy's already saddled in the barn from this morning," he said. "Miss Hawthorne, you ride with Sam. Keep your head. Don't step into water you can't see bottom to." Mrs. Fitzgerald pushed a bundle into Felicity's arms, blankets, a coil of rope, a tin of matches wrapped in oilcloth. "Saints keep you," she whispered, then raised her voice at the boy. "You keep her safe, Samuel Morse, or I'll tan you harder than your mother would." "Yes, ma'am," he said, eyes too wide for bravado. They were out into the rain a breath later, Felicity's skirts already heavy with water by the time she reached the barn. Daisy stamped and tossed her head at the thunder, but settled the instant Felicity laid a hand on her neck. There was steadiness in the mare that Felicity borrowed like a cloak. She swung into the saddle with a speed that would have surprised the Boston version of herself and nodded at Sam, who was already astride a lanky bay with a too-big saddle. "Ride," she said. They cut south along the fence, hooves throwing clods. Rain blew sideways, stinging Felicity's cheeks and running in cold sheets down the back of her neck. The signs of the storm were everywhere. Sticks and summer dust turned to slurry. A piece of tin roofing from the far shed tumbling like a fallen card across the yard. When they broke out toward the creek, she heard it before she saw it. The hoarse, angry sound of water running too fast. The footbridge had been a simple thing. 2 logs with planks spiked across. It was gone without a trace. In its place, the creek had spilled itself wide and wild, brown with silt, shouldering at the banks and hurling branches along like toys. 20 yards upstream, a low bar of gravel rose out of the current by a few feet. On it, small as a sapling, stood a girl of 7 or 8 with a red kerchief tied crookedly on her hair and her arms wrapped around her chest. "Molly!" Sam's voice cracked as he slid off his horse. "Hold on!" And the child turned at his voice, and even through the rain, Felicity could see the terror in her face fight with relief. The gravel bar wasn't much, and the water around it was rising. Felicity measured the distance, the strength of the current, the rope in her arms. "Sam, tie this lead to that cottonwood," she said, pointing at the gnarled trunk 30 feet downstream. "Low around the base, twice, then bring me the free end." Sam ran like a colt loosed, nimble despite the mud. Felicity stripped off her shawl, knotted the rope around her own waist with the kind of good hard knot she'd watched Tucker tie a dozen times, then tied the other end around Daisy's saddle horn and checked the cinch. The mare flicked an ear back at her as if to say, "I'm here." "Molly," Felicity called, pitching her voice low and calm. "I'm coming to you." "All right. You're going to take my hand, and we're going back the way I came. You don't move until I touch you." The girl nodded too quickly, as if she could outrun the fear by shaking her head hard enough. Felicity stepped into the water and hissed as the cold tore at her legs. The current grabbed like hands. She set each foot carefully, testing the bottom, feeling her boots slide and then grip. She kept her eyes on the girl and her shoulders square, the way Tucker had told her to walk a skittish foal. Steady, unhurried, absolute. Halfway across, the water rose above her knees and tried to take her. Daisy sat back on the line without being asked, muscles bunched like coiled rope. Felicity took another step and felt gravel give under her boot. She dropped to a crouch, letting the water go over her thighs rather than under her feet. When she stood again, she was a yard from Molly, close enough to see the little birthmark, like a smudge on the girl's chin. Felicity smiled because there was no room for anything else. "Good girl," she said over the roar. "Now your hand." Molly's fingers were so cold they felt boneless. Felicity wrapped them in her own and shifted so that her body took the force of the water first. "One step," Felicity said. "We're going to count." "1," Molly whispered, and they moved together. 2. The rope tightened, singing faintly. 3. A branch struck Felicity's hip and spun away. She put herself between the current and the child and didn't think about how strong a branch like that could be. 4. They were 2 steps from the bank when the gravel under Felicity's left boot liquefied. Her foot shot out and she went down hard on her right knee. The water hit her in the chest and shoved. Molly cried out as Felicity's grip tore away. The world narrowed to brown water and sound and the burn of cold. She heard Daisy squeal and felt the rope bite her waist and knew 2 things with clarity. If she rolled, she'd be pulled sideways and drowned, and the little hand she'd been holding had vanished. "Sam!" she shouted, or tried to, the creek filling her mouth. And then, over the river's voice, she heard a second sound, a shout that was more command than fear. "Hold the line!" Tucker, he came out of the rain like a man cut from the storm itself, horse throwing mud and foam, lariat already in his hand. He'd ridden at a dead gallop. Felicity saw in some far-off part of her mind the dark streaks along his horse's shoulders and the wet in his hair. He flung himself from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped and planted his boots in the bank. In the same motion he threw the loop. It arced over the water like a sketch of a moon and dropped clean over Molly's shoulders. "I've got you," he called, hauling hand over hand. The rope drew tight across the child's chest and she came toward him, sliding, coughing, eyes huge. Tucker reached in, caught the back of her dress and hauled. Molly came up out of the water like a hooked trout and fell against him, sobbing. "Felicity!" Tucker's head snapped up, searching. She had found her feet somehow and was using the rope like a rail, every muscle shaking with effort. The bank seemed farther away than it had any right to be. Another step and another. Tucker thrust the girl at Sam with a hoarse, "Hold her!" and waded in without a second of calculation. "Don't," she started, but the water took the word. He reached her in 3 strides, and his hands were on her upper arms, and the world steadied with that touch, as if he had set a new floor beneath her. "Yoher." Together they moved, the current trying to pull their legs sideways, and Tucker's body angling against it, taking the force, shielding her. When they gained the bank, he all but lifted her the last 2 feet. He shoved her toward the cottonwood with a gentleness that wasn't softness, and stripped off his coat to throw around her shoulders. Sam had Molly wrapped in the blankets Mrs. Fitzgerald had sent. The girl was still sobbing. Small animal sounds against the roar of the storm. Tucker's hands came to Felicity's face, rough and shaking. "Are you hurt?" Not truly," she managed. The words came from a long way off. Her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely hear herself over them. "Can you ride?" She nodded. He didn't wait for assent. He spun, whistled to his horse, and the animal came obedient as a dog. In the same breath, Tucker had Felicity up and then Molly behind Sam. He threw the ends of the blankets across their laps, cinched them hard, and vaulted up himself. "Ride!" he called, and the 4 of them changed the river's voice for the drum of hooves. They reached the Double R yard as the storm's edge began to lift, the rain slackening into a cold silver curtain. Mrs. Fitzgerald was already at the door with towels and a pot of water steaming like a little sun. She gathered Molly as if she were her own and pushed Sam toward the stove. "Strip those wet things," she commanded. "Scandal and modesty be hanged. You'll catch death otherwise." To Tucker, "You too, Dakota man. You're blue." "I'm fine," he said, but his hands were still shaking and his lips had the color of riverstone. He looked back to Felicity at once. "You first." He shepherded her to the hearth and knelt to untie the knots at her waist with hands that had no right to be so gentle after being that strong. She wanted to tell him she could manage, that Boston had taught her pride and self-containment, but the truth was she wanted those hands on her and the way he said her name like a promise. They wrapped her in blankets and put her feet to the fire. Mrs. Fitzgerald thrust a cup into her hand, broth laced with something that burned and warmed in equal measure. The world came back by degrees, the smell of wet wool and smoke, the hiss of the hearth, Oliver's silhouette in the doorway, his hat dripping steadily and his face creased in relief. "Girl," he said, voice suspiciously rough, "that was reckless and right. Don't make a habit of it." "Yes, sir," she said, and felt a laugh push up despite the ache in her bones. Molly perched on a chair with a blanket up to her chin, color returning in splotches to her cheeks. "I thought the creek was a game," she whispered to Felicity, shame and bravery in equal measure. "I didn't mean—" "You were brave to stand still," Felicity told her. Brave to wait. That's a kind of courage, too. Sam looked like he'd grown an inch in an hour, jaw set, his hand on his sister's shoulder. "Thank you, miss." "It was everyone," she said. "Daisy, Sam, Mr. Reed." Her eyes found Tucker's without her permission. Especially Mr. Reed. He looked away first, which wouldn't have surprised her earlier, but did now. The cord around his heart was pulled tight enough to show in the set of his shoulders. When Mrs. Fitzgerald had everyone settled and a second pot of coffee going, he stepped to the porch and stood looking into the gray as if there were answers hidden in the rain line. Felicity followed him because she had learned something on the river. When water rises, you either meet it or you get carried. He didn't turn when she came up beside him, just spoke in a voice pitched low so it wouldn't break. When Sam came into the south pasture yelling, "I don't think I've ridden that hard since the war. I kept seeing that creek and your shawl floating," and he stopped and shook his head. "Never mind." She reached for his hand. It was cold and nicked from rope burns, but it closed around hers like his body had earlier around her in the current, protective without being possessive. The mountain ridgeline lay in blue folds beyond the rain, and for a moment the noise of the yard dropped away to a single shared breath. "I'm not careless with my life," she said softly. "Not now that I have something I want from it." His thumb moved over her knuckles, slow. "You decided in Helena," he said. Not a question. "I decided," she answered. "I'll go back east to close my affairs, but this—" She nodded toward the yard, the creek, the far pasture where the cattle were dark commas on wet grass. "And you. I want to come back to them. To you." He let out a breath that sounded like a prayer that had been refused once and was being granted now. When he spoke, his voice had steadied. "You saved that little girl," he said. "Walked into a river without thinking of yourself." "I was thinking of her," Felicity said. "And of you, a little, because I knew you'd be furious if I let myself get washed away." That pulled a laugh out of him, the kind that broke the last of the storm. He tugged her hand, and she stepped into him. And when his mouth came down to hers, it wasn't storm or river or falling, but something that felt like landing. The kiss was gentle because the day had been rough, brief because the porch was public ground, and enough to repair whatever the water had tried to take. Behind them, Oliver cleared his throat in the theatrical way of a man who'd once commanded troops. "If you two are finished scaring years off my life," he said, "the Morses are here to fetch their children." Hiram Morse stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his wife beside him, eyes red-rimmed. Gratitude has a weight to it. They brought honey and a loaf of bread and handed them over as if they could square the account. They knew they couldn't. "Reed," Hiram said, voice not much steadier than Tucker's had been. "Miss Hawthorne. Don't know what we'd have done without you." "You'd have done the same," Tucker said. "That's how it is out here." When the door closed behind them, the house felt warmer than the fire could explain. Rain softened to a steady patter on the roof, the storm's fury spent. The creek would be high and muddy for a day, then clear again. The footbridge would be rebuilt. The cattle would settle. The rope burns across Tucker's hands would scab and then fade. That night, when Felicity finally lay down under quilts that smelled faintly of wood smoke and clean cotton, she thought of the way the river had pulled and the way the rope had held. There were lessons in both. The West demanded respect, it demanded nerve, and it repaid those with steady hands and steady hearts. She had not known, until she stepped into that water, how badly she wanted to prove she belonged here, not to Oliver or Mrs. Fitzgerald or the hands or even to Tucker, to herself. Sleep took her quick and kind. In the last sliver of waking, she thought she heard Tucker's boots stop outside her door. There was a pause that felt like a hand laid lightly against the wood, a promise held without hurry. Then his steps moved away toward his own room. The storm had tested them. The river had taught them. And tomorrow would be clean air and sunlight on wet grass, and a ribbon of creek, high but tamed, running past a ranch that felt more like home with every breath she drew. The storm had scoured the valley clean. For 2 days, the air over the Double R smelled of pine and earth washed new, and the sky seemed bluer for the beating it had taken. But Felicity noticed something unsettled in Tucker. He worked longer hours than usual, out with the cattle or mending fence, his shirt damp with sweat even in the chill mornings. When he returned to the house, he was quieter, his easy humor edged by something harder. On the third evening after the storm, Oliver caught her watching Tucker through the window as he strode back from the barn. The older man leaned on his cane, eyes sharp. "You see it, don't you?" he asked. Felicity started. "See what?" "That look on his face." Oliver's voice dropped lower. "Same one he wore after the war. Man comes back whole on the outside, but there's pieces rattling inside that don't always sit quiet." Her heart tightened. "He's been kind. Steady?" Oliver nodded. "He is steady, but he don't always believe he deserves what steadiness brings." That night, Tucker walked her out to the porch. The moon rose fat and golden over the eastern ridge, throwing long shadows across the yard. Felicity wrapped her shawl tighter and waited, sensing words he wanted to say. "They talk, you know," he said finally, eyes on the horizon. "Who?" "Men in town, even some of the hands here." His jaw worked. "About you. About me. About what's proper." Felicity stiffened. "Because I'm staying at the ranch. Because you're Judge Hawthorne's daughter and I'm—" He trailed off, then let the bitterness show. "Just a rancher. A soldier before that. A man who's hauled more calves out of mud than books off a shelf." She stepped closer, close enough that the scent of him, leather, smoke, sweat, curled around her like something familiar. "And yet you read poetry with me. You pulled me out of a river. You saved lives. If they can't see that, Tucker, they're blind." His smile was a shadow, bitter at the edges. "Blind or not, they'll keep talking. You'll have to choose if you can live with it." The next morning brought worse. Word arrived by a passing neighbor that a claim had been filed against the Hawthorne property. The ranch outside Helena Felicity had just decided to keep. According to the neighbor, a man named Roland Briggs claimed her father had promised to sell the land before his death. "It's a lie," Felicity said instantly, fire sparking in her chest. Tucker spread the papers Peterson had delivered across the table. "Briggs has money and friends. He'll try to drag this through court long enough that you'll be tempted to sell just to end the trouble." Oliver slammed his palm on the table. "Judge Hawthorne would never—" "No, he wouldn't," Felicity said firmly. "And I won't let his memory be twisted that way." The days that followed pressed heavy. Felicity met with Mr. Abernathy, who confirmed the claim but promised to contest it. Still, the prospect of a public fight unsettled her. She had come west to settle her father's affairs quietly, not to be drawn into a dispute. At night, she read her father's journal, searching for entries that might help. She found one, dated just weeks before his passing. "Briggs approached me again about buying the land. I told him what I always tell him, that this land is not for sale, not now, not ever. It is Felicity's." He walked away smiling, but there was poison in it. "I pray she will be strong enough to resist when he tries again." Her throat ached as she read. She could almost hear his voice urging her to stand firm. When she showed the entry to Tucker, his expression hardened. Then it settled. "We'll fight him." "We?" she asked softly. His eyes met hers, steady now. "Your father left you this land, Felicity, but if you'll allow it, I'll stand beside you to protect it. Whatever comes." Her heart leapt, though fear still pressed at the edges. "And if the town whispers louder?" Tucker reached across the table, covering her hand with his calloused one. "Then let them whisper. I've lived through worse than gossip." That night, she stood once more at her window. Beyond the dark fields, the river gleamed faintly in the moonlight. It had tested her courage, and she had not failed. Now came a new test of her will, of her father's legacy, of whether she could truly belong in this untamed place. But she was no longer alone. She had Tucker beside her, his steadiness anchoring her fear, his touch reminding her of what was worth fighting for. Tomorrow, they would face Roland Briggs. Tonight, Felicity whispered into the Montana night, "I choose to stay." And for the first time since arriving, the land itself seemed to answer, the cottonwoods rustling like voices of the past, giving their blessing. The courthouse in Helena rose like a sentinel on the edge of Main Street, its clapboard walls painted white, its bell tower sharp against the pale autumn sky. The morning air carried a chill that whispered of winter, and Felicity's breath misted as she climbed the steps. Tucker walked at her side, every line of his body taut with purpose. Oliver had stayed behind at the ranch, insisting his son and Felicity would represent the family best. Inside, the smell of ink, wood polish, and coal smoke mingled in the high-ceilinged chamber. A crowd had gathered, not just lawyers and clerks, but townsfolk too, curious for drama. Felicity felt their eyes on her, some sympathetic, some skeptical. She lifted her chin, summoning every ounce of Boston poise and her father's blood that still ran in her veins. Mr. Abernathy was already waiting, his thin frame more rigid than usual. He bowed slightly as Felicity entered. "Miss Hawthorne, Mr. Reed, the hearing will be brief, but the repercussions may not." Across the aisle, Roland Briggs stood surrounded by two men in dark suits. He was a burly man in his 50s, his beard trimmed neatly, his expression smug. His eyes lingered on Felicity a moment too long, as if he could intimidate her simply by looking. She returned his gaze without flinching. The magistrate called the matter to order. Briggs's lawyer, a smooth-voiced man with a slick mustache, rose first. "Your Honor, my client asserts that Judge Hawthorne promised in good faith to sell the disputed property. Though the judge unfortunately passed before executing the deed, the intention was clear. We ask the court to enforce that agreement." Mr. Abernathy rose next. "Your Honor, there is no written agreement, only the word of a man with vested interests." Judge Hawthorne was meticulous in his records, and nowhere does he mention a sale. The land belongs to his daughter, Miss Felicity Hawthorne, by lawful inheritance. Briggs smirked, as though Abernathy's words slid off him like water off stone. The magistrate turned to Felicity. "Miss Hawthorne, do you wish to add anything?" Her heart thudded. The room seemed too still, the faces too many. But she thought of her father's journal, of his words inked in steady hand. "This land is Felicity's. It is not for sale. Not now. Not ever." She rose, smoothing her skirt. "Your Honor, I do not pretend to know all the ways of Montana courts, but I know my father. He was a man of law, a man of honor. If he had intended to sell, he would have done so properly. He did not. He left the land to me, and I intend to honor his wishes. I will not sell to Mr. Briggs or anyone else." Her voice rang clearer than she expected. Somewhere behind her, Tucker shifted, and she felt his strength, like a hand at her back, even though he hadn't moved. Briggs's lawyer objected, citing hearsay and speculation. Abernathy countered with calm precision, producing the will, the property inventory, and even copies of prior letters Briggs himself had written to Judge Hawthorne offering to buy the land, letters that had all been declined. The magistrate studied the documents, his brow furrowed. After a long pause, he said, "This court finds no evidence of a binding contract. The property remains with Miss Hawthorne as lawful heir. Case dismissed." Relief flooded Felicity so swiftly her knees almost gave. She sat, hands trembling, and felt Tucker's warm palm close over hers beneath the table. Briggs's face flushed a dangerous red, but he said nothing. He merely gathered his men and stormed out, the echo of his boots sharp as gunfire on the wood floor. The townsfolk began to murmur, some nodding approval, others whispering behind hands. Felicity felt the weight of their gazes. She had been judged not just by law, but by society, and found either wanting or worthy, depending on the eyes. But she realized something. It no longer mattered as much as she once thought. Outside on the courthouse steps, the autumn sun broke through a thin veil of clouds. Felicity drew in a breath of crisp air, letting it fill her lungs with freedom. "You spoke well," Tucker said softly. She looked up at him, startled. "You think so?" "I know so." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "You sounded like your father, only fiercer." Emotion swelled in her throat. "I was terrified." "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's choosing to stand anyway." For a moment, the busy street faded away. Felicity saw only the man beside her, the one who had caught her from a runaway wagon, who had steadied her in a raging river, who now stood guard at her side in the face of whispers and threats. That evening, back at the hotel, Felicity opened her father's journal again. She read by lamplight until the words blurred, then closed the book with a kind of reverence. "You would be proud of me today, Father," she whispered. "And you would like Tucker. I think you would see in him what I do. Strength, loyalty, a heart that doesn't falter when storms rise." There was a knock at her door. She opened it to find Tucker, hat in hand. He hesitated a beat, then said, "Just wanted to be sure you're all right." "I am," she said. "Because of you." His gaze softened. "Not just me. You did most of it yourself." Still, when he turned to leave, she caught his sleeve. "Stay," she said quietly. "Just for a while. We don't have to talk. Just stay." So he did. They sat in the quiet lamplight, the journal between them on the table, the night outside filled with Helena's restless hum. And for the first time, Felicity felt not like a visitor passing through Montana, but like a woman with roots just beginning to take hold. Snow had begun to brush the mountain ridges with white, though the valley floor still wore autumn's gold. At Judge Hawthorne's little ranch outside Helena, the aspen grove shimmered in pale light, their leaves rattling like 1,000 whispered promises. Felicity stood on the porch, her hand resting on the railing her father had built years ago, and felt the strange sensation of two lives pulling at her. Boston with its polished lecture halls, and Montana with its untamed skies. Behind her, Tucker's boots sounded steady on the planks. She turned, and there he was, hat in hand, shoulders broad in his worn coat, the man who had been beside her through storm, trial, and whispered judgment. He stopped just short of her, as if giving her space to choose. "You've been quiet since the hearing," he said gently. Felicity smiled faintly. "Quiet isn't the same as uncertain. I've been thinking about Father's words, about what this place means, about what you mean." He waited, his gaze steady, a man who had learned patience on long cattle drives and in longer silences. She took a breath, the cool air sharp in her chest. "Boston gave me education, comfort, and respectability. But here, I've found something more. Challenge, purpose, and—" Her eyes locked on his. "And you." Tucker's jaw shifted, the smallest crack in his composure. He stepped closer. "Felicity, I've tried to keep my feelings measured, to give you space to decide. But every day since I caught you on that trail, I've known. You belong here, with me, if you'll have it." From his pocket, he pulled a small wooden box, plain but smoothed with care. He opened it to reveal a silver ring, not ornate but sturdy, set with a single polished turquoise stone that glowed like a fragment of Montana sky. "My grandmother's," he said softly. "Pa gave it to Ma when they wed. I'd be proud to see you wear it." The world seemed to still. Felicity felt the weight of her father's journal in her satchel. The echo of his words. "This land is yours. Find what speaks to your soul." And she knew, in that instant, that her soul had answered. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. "Yes, Tucker Reed, I will marry you." Relief and joy broke across his face, raw and unguarded. He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hands rough but careful, and then drew her into his arms. The kiss they shared beneath the aspen trees was not rushed, not desperate. It was steady, like the land itself, like the promise they had just made. Word spread quickly through Helena and Willow Creek. Some whispered still, about propriety, about Boston blood mixing with frontier grit, but the voices no longer carried weight. At the wedding, held in the little church by the creek, the pews were filled with ranch hands, neighbors and townsfolk who had come not for spectacle but out of genuine affection. Oliver Reed stood proudly at Tucker's side, his eyes damp but his back straight. Mrs. Fitzgerald fussed over every detail, declaring Felicity the prettiest bride this valley's ever seen. Even Mr. Abernathy attended, offering a stiff but heartfelt blessing. When Felicity walked down the aisle, she carried not roses or lace, but a bouquet of aspen branches and wild sage, symbols of endurance and healing. Tucker's gaze never left her, blue eyes fierce and tender all at once. Their vows were simple, no poetry but the poetry of truth. "I choose you," Tucker said, voice low but steady enough for all to hear. "And I choose you," Felicity replied, her hand firm in his. Afterward, beneath a sky brushed with winter clouds, the small crowd gathered at the Double R. There was laughter, fiddle music, and children chasing one another through the yard. Felicity's borrowed blue dress swirled as Tucker spun her once on the porch, his dimple flashing when she laughed. Later, when the guests had gone and only the crackle of the fire remained, Tucker led her outside. Snowflakes had begun to fall, light as whispers, dusting the ground in silver. "Do you regret it?" he asked quietly, though his arms were firm around her waist. "Not one choice," she said. "Every turn, every trial brought me here. To you." He kissed her forehead, then rested his against hers. "Then we'll build it together. A home, a family, a life that's ours." Months passed, and the ranch thrived. Felicity found joy not only in Tucker's arms, but in the rhythm of work and community. She started a small school in the church hall, teaching children their letters and stories. Tucker teased her that even the calves seemed calmer when she read aloud nearby. One crisp spring morning, she placed her hand over the gentle swell of her belly and whispered to Tucker, "Our story's only beginning." His arms closed around her, and his voice, low and reverent, promised, "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Years later, on their 10th anniversary, Tucker led her back to the aspen grove where he had first offered her the turquoise ring. Their children ran ahead, laughter bright against the rustle of leaves. Felicity touched the scarred bark of one tree and thought of her father's words again. She had found what spoke to her soul, not just the land, not just the wide Montana sky, but the family they had built, the love that had steadied them through storm and whisper, trial and triumph. As the wind shook the aspen leaves, their sound was no longer whispers of doubt, but a hymn of belonging. And beneath that sound, Tucker took her hand, kissed her knuckles, and said simply, "Still my choice, every day." Felicity smiled, eyes shining, "And mine." The vow they had made in shadow and storm still held stronger than ever, as bright and enduring as the Montana sky under which they had built their forever.